Subsidizing Culture, Taxpayer Enrichment of the Creative Class. I'm Heather Godwin, and this is Bookmarks. Hello and welcome to Bookmarks. I'm your host, Heather Godwin. Governments have financially supported the arts for centuries. In the modern United States, this support comes in the form of grants from agencies such as the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities. But a new book by James T. Bennett, Subsidizing Culture, Taxpayer Enrichment of the Creative Class, takes a critical look at the U.S. government's support for the arts and questions if it is still necessary. Dr. Bennett joins us today. He is an eminent scholar at George Mason University. He holds the William P. Snavely Chair of Political Economy and Public Policy in the Department of Economics and is director of the John M. Olin Institute for Employment Practice and Policy. He received his PhD from Case Western Reserve University in 1970. He is founder and editor of the Journal of Labor Research and has published more than 60 articles in professional journals such as the American Economic Review, the Review of Economics and Statistics, Policy Review, Public Choice, and the Cato Journal. And joining us via Skype to critique the book is James A. Leach, Chair in Public Affairs, visiting professor of law, and senior scholar at the University of Iowa College of Law. He is former chairman of the National Endowment for the Humanities and served for 30 years as a representative in Congress, after which he was a professor at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton University, an interim director of the Institute of Politics, and lecturer at the John F. Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. He is the recipient of numerous awards and has served on the boards of several public companies and nonprofit organizations. Gentlemen, thank you both for joining us.
Well, I'm pleased to be with you and Professor Bennett.
My pleasure as well. Thanks for having us.
So, James Bennett, could you give us in a nutshell the main thesis of your book?
The main thesis is that it is inappropriate for government to be involved in subsidizing culture, taking money from one group of taxpayers and giving it to others who may not be at all interested in the topics that are being explored and discussed and so on and so forth. And the book basically takes a bit of a historical perspective in terms of looking at how we got to where we are today through four different venues. One is the New Deal, which basically legitimated this whole thing with the federal theater writers and artists arts programs. And then, of course, we see the heavy hand of government using it for propaganda purposes right after World War II and during the Cold War through the CIA support of modern art. And then there is, of course, the National Endowment for the Arts and Humanities. And so we look at those four. But I might point out that this whole process is endemic throughout the United States, not just at the federal government, but there's a tremendous amount of support at the state and local levels of government for the performing arts in particular. And you can't cover it all, so I just tried to talk about the various aspects of it as it relates to these four periods of the federal government.
And James Leach, what is your critique of the book?
Well, first, by perspective, I'm not quite as skeptical as Professor Bennett about a modest federal involvement in the arts and humanities, but I want to note this is a very skillfully written book. Its strength is its narrative about the New Deal in particular, and what is a kind of a little noticed and long forgotten episode in our history when the intelligence agencies were involved with certain post-World War II issues when we were in kind of a cultural war, in fact still are, with adversaries around the world, particularly the Soviet Union and now Russia. But I would like to emphasize that a modest level of federal participation is defensible. And what we're talking about with the National Endowment of the Humanities and National Endowment of the Arts is each is about 6/1000th of 1% of the federal budget, and that comes to about a postage stamp a year for the average for all American citizens. So it's not a great taxpayer risk issue. What can be considered at risk is the national interest of the United States. There are virtually no federal programs that affect all citizens. And so the question is, what federal programs and to what degree what does one have to affect some citizens? The case for the New Deal was that we had programs to put people back to work, people that weren't employed. So we hired bricklayers and we built federal buildings under Treasury programs, and then the famous Works Progress Administration, nicknamed or considered the WPA, which put, by the way, 7 million unemployed Americans back to work in the late 30s. Now, having noted that, one of the subjects was, should artists come under the same circumstance as bricklayers? And the government made a decision, yes, that made sense. And it had a number of aspects to it. One, it provided food and lodging for a fairly large number of artists, as well as a very small number of writers. And in so doing, it kept the arts alive, and it involved a number of aspects, one of which was a sheer teaching one. For example, here in Iowa, the artist Grant Wood had something called the Stone City Endeavor, in which artists from all over our state, my state, which is, I'm sure you recognize, is the most important state in the country, would come and assemble and not only create art, but learn how to become better artists. And so it was a teaching circumstance as well as a artistic endeavor. And the same implicitly was the case when the WPA put people to work building, as it happened to be, the grade school I went to in Davenport, Iowa. And it not only put people to work, but it taught them trades as they worked. And that was the same thing in the arts. And it's, I think there's a little underestimation in the book of the actual quality of the arts of the 30s. The WPA era was an extraordinary era of creativity. And it involved easel programs, that is oil on canvas. It involved sculpture, but in some ways was best known for its printmaking. And so you had regionalists like Grant Wood and Thomas Hart Benton and John Stuart Curry create really invigorating themes about what was happening in America. And so part of the effort was to have artists create. It was also to have a chronicle of what was happening in this country. And so you had artists who would celebrate labor, you had artists who would celebrate change, you had artists who would celebrate happy things like Doris Lee happening in the kitchen. And you had an uplift that the arts provided.
So it seems that the overarching theme of the book is whether or not it's appropriate to have the government fund the arts. And a big question that comes to mind for me, for both of you gentlemen, is arts and sciences are, you hear that all the time with the great Roman Empire, with the Ottoman Empire, with Italy. It's not just sciences, it's arts and sciences. And I know that there's been a tremendous push in this country to try to encourage students, youth, and a culture of encouraging the sciences. Why do we not tie arts to that as well? So why would it not be appropriate to help flourish a culture of arts to accompany sciences?
Well, I see Mr. Leach as sort of suggesting that, hey, if government didn't provide education, it wouldn't exist. If government didn't do the arts, it wouldn't exist. I think there's a huge fallacy in there. And furthermore, I think that there are two aspects to everything. Number one is the funding, and number two is the provision. For example, I'm part of the problem, if you will, because I'm a professor at a public university. But it strikes me that what would be much more desirable is if we wish to have government support of education, that's fine. But what we should do is not have public institutions providing it. We should give a certain amount of money, sort of like a school voucher program, and then let the schools compete and so forth. Because I think in general you'll find that a lot of, if you look at the rankings of colleges and universities, that the private institutions seem to do considerably better than the necessarily the public ones. But what I'm really concerned about here is the fact that we have my wife and I do not like ballet, and we don't care very much for modern dance. And I'm not a poetry reader. I do read a lot, but I'm not into poetry. But it seems to me rather unfair that money is taken from me and given to some bureaucrat in Washington who decides how my money is going to be spent. We give, if I just make an aside, we have a group at George Mason University called Friends of Music, and I'm on the board of that. We raise scholarship money for student performances, which, by the way, are very good, and I hope some of our listeners will come and see it. But I get to support what I want to support. It's my money, not money to be spent down the road for someone else. And in terms of, all right, the Cold War stuff and everything, if we're going to have it, let's have transparency here. Let's not have the CIA setting up dummy corporations and dummy foundations and wheeling and double dealing and so on and so forth. And by the way, I'm not sure that we really have a good idea of just how much this accomplished in fighting communism. We know we spent a lot of money, but what did we get for that? That's another issue. And I'm not expecting you to come out and tell us how much we got from it, but it's not certain to me that that was necessarily all that effective.
Well, Professor, let me just say, it's hard to respond to a straw argument. That is, I'm not arguing that the government should do everything. I'm suggesting that the National Endowment for the Arts, the National Endowment for Humanities are very, very modest-sized governmental entities, and that their role is quite modest, but not unimportant. And it's a little different than the case of the 30s or the 50s. But if you say to yourself, does America have a good understanding of the rest of the world? And if you say to yourself, did we know what we were doing when we invaded Iraq? Did we have any idea what Sunni and Shia were? Does it not matter that we do basic research and that you have scholars that tell us the distinctions between religions, that you have scholars that tell us the history of regions, that you have thoughtful people capable of operating a democratic society? It used to be that the principal case in the 19th century that people gave for having a university was to train citizens. And we have a real citizenship obligation.
And so how does this relate to his book and the subject of the book?
Well, let me relate it to the National Endowment for the Humanities,
okay,
which I once headed. We have a cutback in humanities funding around the country today. It's rather stark. And my personal view is this whole field of endeavor called STEM, that's science, technology, engineering, and math, is totally appropriate and mightily important. But STEM advances without humanities input in understanding them it can be very dangerous to society. And so I like to talk about what some people have referenced as STEAMs, that is science, technology, engineering, arts, and math, and I even like to talk about humanisTEAM, broadening the concept to a far greater variety of subject matter, you need to bring all together. And it's helpful to a society in the national interest and understanding abroad, where after all, we've spent $4 trillion in the last decade, to trying to make policy that's thoughtful before one engages in what might be endeavors that are difficult to justify in retrospect.
Well, that leads to a good question for you, Mr. Bennett, from one of our viewers, Marvin Greer. Is there ever an appropriate situation for the government to support the arts?
Well, times change, situations change. They were supporting a lot of people during the Great Depression, but we're not in the Great Depression now. And I'm rather uncomfortable with some of the stuff that you said, Mr. Leach. On the one hand, you're saying, hey, don't worry about it because it's nickels and dimes. You've used the word modest on a number of occasions. In other words, it's just a small amount of money. But remember Senator Everett Dirksen? I'm sure you do. You take $1 billion here and $1 billion there, and it soon adds up to real money. I'm more arguing on the idea of principle. And a second theme that I think seems to run through your argument is that if we did not have the government involved in this, it would not exist. And I don't think that's the case. Pardon?
I'm not arguing that. You're throwing up straw men.
Okay. Well, you're saying maybe not enough of it would exist. And I don't see that as the case at all. You know, I have never applied to government for a grant under any circumstances for any reason, because they will look at my vita and they will see that most of what I've written is sort of questioning government and what it does and how it operates. For example, I wrote this book some years ago called Homeland Security Scams, which got some pretty good press, by the way. But you know,
there's been some interesting responses.
It just seems to me that when any money that is in the political arena, politics are going to get involved in the situation. And I just don't see that this is an appropriate role for government. And regardless of how much or how little, on principle, I think there are alternative sources of funding. And I think in many cases, we really would be better off if the government got out of it. Well, and furthermore, I understand fully the notion of peer review. I have been on peer review panels. I edited a journal. I was a peer-reviewed journal. And I know this, that people think that, hey, if he's doing what I'm doing or she's doing what I'm doing, it's good. Otherwise, I'm not sure about it. But if these people are so fantastic, why do they need money from me?
Mr. Leach, I can't wait to hear your answer.
First of all, many that are at the pinnacle of their profession aren't applying for these grants, Professor. Many that are at the well-funded public and private universities have lots of discretion on free time, etc. The people who apply are often the youngest, those just beginning. They're often people that do not have the right to take time off, and this gives them a little bit of extra time to work on projects, to make them better than they otherwise would be, to make them happen when they wouldn't have happened. And we're quite careful on that. And they're not huge sums of money, but they make a real difference in the academic world. Now, having said that, I want to go back to the subject of modesty. The two major endowments we're talking about, the National Endowment for the Arts and the National Endowment for the Humanities, peaked in funding in 1979, and in real dollar terms are 1/3 as big as they were then. These are very modest institutions, and that is what you're talking about. Now, the government involvement in the arts, the government involvement in the humanities is vastly, vastly greater than these two institutions are. These institutions play niche roles. I think they're important. And I think they're particularly important in the humanities today, because if you look at our society, if you listen to what is happening in the American political system, the case for deeper understanding of issues, the case for deeper dialogue and more civil dialogue is not trivial.
Okay, now let's take another question from one of our viewers, from Kristen Little. Is there value in maintaining federal funding for the arts simply as a way to reinforce the values our society stands for? Mr. Bennett.
Well, why is government reinforcing anything? I mean, do we really need a nanny state? Do we need a federal bureaucracy telling me what to think, what to like, where to go, what to attend? I mean, this is elitist in the worst possible way.
And Mr. Leach, do you have a rebuttal?
Well, expressed in the way Professor Bennett does, there'd be no one that would disagree. But these institutions aren't telling people what to think, how to think. What they're doing, they're being led by innovative people in the United States that want a chance to make a mark. They want a chance to add something to the great landscape of artistic endeavor, to the great landscape of human thinking. And they're doing it in their way and seeking some support for it. And that is what these institutions are established to do. Now, one can say, we've lived without them for part of our history. There's no reason we can't live without them now. That's a case. Will we be as fine a society? All I can tell you is that the institution I headed has assisted writers to produce over 1 billion words of new knowledge. It has won over 24 Pulitzer Prizes and Bancroft Prizes, some of the highest awards in academia. There are studies that have been done that have indicated without a little bit of support, that have allowed time off, that have allowed greater funding, that their works would not have been as deep and as thorough. And I think that's worthy of thinking through.
It's amazing when you look into what's going on in this crowdfunding. For example, this one fellow had a proposal to develop a beehive. And this beehive was different in that it has a valve in the bottom that the honey flows out of, that you don't have to disturb the bees to get the honey, okay? His goal was to raise $70,000. He raised over $12 million. There are people out there anxiously looking for ways to give money. And this is in the arts, it's to poets, it's to writers. And in fact, if I may just bring to your attention this article in Poets and Writers, which says it's Campaign for Cash, crowdfunding tips for writers. And it talks about how to be successful in raising money. And, you know, it just strikes me that if these people are really that good, they will succeed in this way. And the whole idea of people in Washington bringing in an expert, I've long ago given up on this notion of experts. If I could just take one moment and talk about two instances. I'm sure that you remember the Gulf War and all this other kind of stuff, and each of the major broadcasting systems had their military experts who predicted tens of thousands of American deaths, and they had the battle-hardened Republican Guard that was just going to decimate American forces. Less than 200 were killed. And then there was, as the Iraqis retreated, they set all these oil wells on fire. The oil wells, the Friends of the Earth and the environmental this and that. It was it was a catastrophe. It would take years. It would block out the sun, crops, famine, starvation. It took less than 6 weeks for Red Adair to get the job done. But of course, I really have problems with experts. What you consider an expert and what I consider an expert may be very different. What you consider good poetry, good writing, good art, good whatever, I might consider very, very different. And I think people should be able to express their own preferences.
Okay. And now it's time for Answer This, where the reviewer gets to ask a question directly to the author. Mr. Leach, go ahead. Do you have a question for Mr. Bennett?
Well, all I can say is that we're in a world that has unprecedented things happening. For the first time in world history, we have terrorism that's been globalized. For the first time in world history, we have weapons of mass destruction that are being proliferated in ways that have never been seen before. The danger of war, the danger of catastrophic war is exceptionally high. Should not the United States put a full score effort, not only to techniques that are scientific and technical to defend the country, but in ways that advance greater understanding of foreign societies? Should we not put greater resources to bear on the studies of various languages, the studies of various cultural factors in other countries, the various threats that there are in the world, so that when circumstances arise, that we are prepared in thought to have the right counter policies?
And your response?
Well, I think it's very simple to respond. You seem to suggest that unless the government spends buckets and buckets of money, not much of this will exist, or not enough of this will exist. There's all kinds of work going on in all of the areas that you talked about in academia, where it's still publish or perish. There's a lot of stuff out there. And, it strikes me that Americans are innovative enough and insightful enough. We're going to get the job done. And I don't think we necessarily are put that far ahead if the government's involved.
Okay, that's all we have time for. Again, the book is Subsidizing Culture, Taxpayer Enrichment of the Creative Class by James T. Bennett. Thanks to Dr. Bennett for joining us to discuss the book, and thanks to James Leach of the University of Iowa for his critique. And thank you for watching Bookmarks. I'm Heather Godwin, and we'll see you next time.